Hello and welcome to session 20 of the Stafford Beer Brain of the Firm reading group. We are continuing our reading of chapter 13, Environments of Decision, System 4. And we're picking up on the bottom of page 186 right here. So it says, before exploring further the nature of the corporate planning function, which continuously aborts, it seems necessary to enrich the model a little. So far, management has been seen as a regulatory activity necessary to control earnings at a level above some minimum necessary for security. But it has a second regulatory function, to control the match between product attributes. Yes, attributes, yes. Sorry. That is a word that I get people on YouTube criticizing me for my pronunciation on, so trying to get that right.
How do you pronounce it?
So, attributes, I believe, is the correct pronunciation, and attributes is the one that I learned as a kid. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway.
Speaking of regulation, yes.
Attribute is the noun and attribute is the verb.
I believe that is correct. Yes, that is correct. But I always pronounce them the same until YouTube corrected me. Attributes and market demand. The first kind of regulation is performed in the face of perturbations introduced by the environmental economy, both of the nation and of competition in the money market. The second is performed in the face of market perturbations, which may be due to the aggressive marketing policies of competitors, but which are fundamentally caused by the rate of technological innovation. The management organization of System 4 ought to consist of an institutional embodiment of the two major control loops associated with these two kinds of regulation. Usually, this simply does not exist. In Figure 36 appears the minimally richer model required to explain these points and to draw some major conclusions about the control parameters of capital F of S. This model is derived from work done by my colleague R.H. Anderton, and it indicates both major kinds of regulatory activity. Note how earnings generate future earnings and how this flow is quote-unquote pumped by the market and its demands. Revenue is shown as generated by the match between existing product attributes, including price, and the demands of the market as conditioned by the economic climate and available technological alternatives for satisfying the same basic needs. Investment funds are seen to be divided between product improvement, A, product innovation, B, and the potential operating efficiency, C. These three factors, which it is open to management to control, represent capabilities of the firm between which investment choices must be made. According to this model, there are only two more control parameters in the entire system worth considering. One is the responsiveness, or inertia, of the market, X, and the second is the power to borrow money, Y, both of which are conditioned by other kinds of managerial action. So we see this in the next page, 188 is figure 36. So we can see the model has been adjusted. It's been complicated by these considerations. So essentially, investment capital can go into A, B, and C. And the model also takes into account the effect of technological change, X1, and economic change, X2, on demand. Now, the A and B plus X1 and X2 condition revenue, whereas C conditions cost. And the money market conditions, as you might imagine, the amount of investment capital, because investment capital can draw on internal reserves or borrow from the money market. So this is pretty basic, sort of like Capital Volume 2 kind of stuff here. But yeah, interesting to see it presented in sort of a cybernetic way. All right. So the value of any cybernetic model, however simple, of the firm derives from its dynamic characteristics. The model used in System 4 is no exception. It facilitates the examination of corporate plans on the indefinite time base, which invalidates so many static models of the corporate economy. For there are no crucial dates in the development of the firm, except those specified by convention. It is sad to see the whole process of corporate adaptation geared to the purely conventional annual statement of accounts and the chairman's address. Consider, for example, the marked difference which is bound to exist between the time constants of the three investment channels, A, B, and C, product improvement, innovation, and better performance. Secondly, there may well be a sluggish, long-term constant output response to certain kinds of fast-varying input because of the complexities of the total system which damp down the initial oscillations. There may also be amplifiers in the system which increase the amplitude of dangerous oscillations that ought to be damped. It is the task of System 4 to study all these phenomena through its models, and it ought also to monitor managerial action as being itself a generator of oscillation. For one thing is sure about a system of this sort. It is that the control target of steady response, which entails steady profit-making and steady growth, can be achieved only relatively. The important outcome of regulation is, as we learned from our study of homeostasis, to hold critical response variables within physiological limits. Okay, so what do people have to say about this section? Jeremy, go ahead.
I think it's really interesting how Silicon Valley and just tech in general since 1972 have changed this. Like, in the States, we've had Tim Cook and Mark Zuckerberg and people from Alphabet all testifying before Congress about just how incredibly shitty their systems are. And you get this divergence between the absolutely massive tech giants who just make so much money, and they take the money and just offshore it and just have more cash than anyone thought was fathomable 10 years ago. And then you have small startups whose goal is to be bought by these giants. And so, I really don't get the sense that people at Facebook are lying awake at night wanting a better UI. I think what they're really thinking about is, how do we make the funnel such that the money is bigger? How do we get more clicks, more ad revenue? So it's really interesting to see, like, the most powerful tech companies basically trying to turn into these turbocharged funnels of sucking in revenue rather than this process. If they had this process and there was serious concern about improving existing products, creating new ones, tweaking performance, I don't think they would look like a deer in the headlights when people from Congress asked them why things were so fucked up and shitty. It would be on their agenda.
Yeah, Beer points out that the important outcome of regulation is, as we learned in our study of homeostasis, to hold critical response variables within physiological limits. Now, the physiological limits for these giant tech firms are actually extremely lax, which is kind of why I think you see this behavior. As you said, they funnel in so much cash, both from the money market and also from just ad revenue, or in the case of Apple, sales and then rents made from, exploiting their brand power. that, the constraints are really quite lax. And so maintaining homeostasis is really not very difficult for them. And therefore you get an organization which has not really been subject to, evolutionary constraints for some time. Shane, go ahead, then Matt.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that jumps out for me here is the way that System 4 is going to integrate over many divergent and overlapping time horizons. That there's going to be all kinds of temporal dynamics in the system that System 4 needs to smooth over and integrate. You'll have very fast-moving dynamics and very slow dynamics that System 4 has to juggle. Fun. Yeah.
Yeah, again, this very reminiscent of Marx's presentation in Capital Volume 2, considering sort of like the temporality of cycles of capital and his reproduction schema. You kind of get that in this diagram. Okay, Matt, go ahead.
I'm thinking about how this maps onto like companies where like it's not even about revenue, like whatever tenuous connection to like an actual business, something like Facebook actually has, versus like a Twitter that really is just. It's a monopoly play, but like everything is vanity. That means everything is vanity metrics in the short term. And so, like, I think in a way that they might even have kind of more developed System 4s than most companies, because it's the way why are you looking in that section? That's where the light is. It's not like you have reason to believe that they're measuring things that are easy for them to measure, and then they're measuring their success by these vanity metrics that are just easy for them to measure, and so they actually probably can be more sophisticated in System 4 sense, but like purely in like the imaginary castle in the sky way, that they just invented.
Right, they're good at chasing the metrics that are going to make for good presentations. Because, if you look at where money comes from, very little of it for them is from, or for some of these companies at least, very little of it is from earnings. Most of it is from money market. Brett, go ahead.
Yeah, but even when it is from earnings, it's like Amazon can just like, see, like they can say just saying on Congress, they can just like use their metrics from other sellers to like improve their own product, and like I don't even know where that fits into this whole thing, but it feels like a very System 4 System 5 thing where they can just like basically steal someone else's product and sell it because they know it's popular.
Yeah, definitely. That would be a component of Amazon's System 4 is their like ability to monopolize competitor information and steal it when it is advantageous for them, so that they can put out a line of like Amazon Basics that is based on stolen information. So yeah, that would be a System 4 function for sure. Okay, well let's continue reading through this. I think we can all sort of acknowledge that Beer says that this is a minimal viable model. Like, this is as simple as you could make it without losing the point. So certainly, if you want to look at any given firm, especially firms that operate on, late capitalist accumulation strategies, it may diverge from what we're seeing here to some degree or be complicated. So 189, now take a look at the way Figure 35 is enriched in Figure 37 as a result of thinking depicted by Figure 36. The 5 control parameters of the system, A, B, C, X, and Y, are now gathered into a box of control settings through which the feedback can operate. Note that every line on the diagram should be drawn as 5 separate lines, one to each control parameter. The diagram has been simplified because each has its own characteristic time constants. So I don't believe he's saying it's simplified to one line because of the characteristic time constants. He's saying there should be a separate line for each of them because they have their own characteristic time constants. In addition, there is now a feed-forward loop, which activates the kind of model shown in Figure 36. The predictions of this model are compared with real-life outcomes to generate the feedback that activates the corporate planning return loop. So we have here, I goes into parametric control settings, which goes to E, which is then fed into the feed forward, which is the model that has been developed in the Figure 36, and the actual company activity. So you have like company activity is F of S, and then the model of F of S, or sorry, the model of the organization compares F of S with F prime of S, and makes adjustments there. The feedback, or sorry, the company activity goes into output, but it also feeds back into capital F of S, which is the corporate planning. So that may actually be some of the elements that we were discussing there, which are not included in Figure 36, but would be included in System 4 nonetheless, because System 4 includes both the feed forward and the feedback, right? Those are the two different components of it. All right. So all this assumes that two kinds of basic regulatory mechanism have been isolated, as remarked before, and I do not think that this is as arbitrary as it may seem. When we consider the firm as an organism operating in an environment and contemplate the intrinsic nature of business itself, it does seem very clear that both the money market and the product market must be satisfied. There are other interests to satisfy too. No doubt job satisfaction and the monetary requirements of the labor force are critical. But such demands on the system might best be regarded as constraints rather than major homeostatic loops of the total ecosystem, particularly because the firm's response to the first two greatly conditions the climate in which the rest of managerial responsibility will be discharged. Okay, so what do we have to say about this? It seems to me that, it's like, I guess he's saying that those things would these internal things would largely be handled by System 3, because they're sort of contingent on the overall interaction of the organism with its environment. But let's go to Shane and then Jeremy.
Yeah, I kind of read this as like that. These other things, right? So job satisfaction and compensation for the labor force and stuff are factors, but they're not the prime feedback loop that's conditioning the entire enterprise. Like in capitalist societies and capitalist firms, it's the market, both the product market and the money market, that disciplines the entire thing, and then secondarily, the conditions for, say, labor compensation are set. And this, I think this bears out, right? That like, the market rules everything, and you get sort of labor compensation driven into the ground as like something the firm can live without. Basically, like the firm can't live without the money market and the product market, but it can live without happy workers, or whatever. Like it can sell out the workforce pretty easily. It turns out that that's not a primary thing; it's a secondary thing in capitalist firms.
Yeah, and I should clarify that the wage relation is actually an interaction with the external environment. But I think it's the case in capitalism that relationship is largely conditioned in the aggregate by the state of class struggle between the capitalists and workers. And therefore, it has more of the appearance of a constraint or an internal dynamic because it's being conditioned by systems that are outside of the firm, right?
It's
like
cost-cutting concern.
Yeah, and it's being held down by all of the functions of labor disclism that happen. Basically by the reserve army of labor.
Right. It will be similar to gravity, right? That like all organisms on the Earth are conditioned by gravity, but they're all conditioned in a kind of ambient way by it. So you wouldn't say that gravity is really an internal dynamic of the organism, because they all do it,
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't want to suggest that the iron law of wages is true, but there are certainly conditioning factors that are way beyond the firm. Jeremy, go ahead, and then we'll go to Tom and then to Jake.
Whenever I hear Beer talking about constraints when it comes to revenue, I always think of one of the major themes of Platform for Change, which he was writing at the same time. And in Platform for Change, he introduces the Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia and says that eudaimonia is sort of the highest good where people are living their best lives. And he says that money is terribly, terribly important. But ultimately, the goal of systems is eudaimonia, not money. That money ultimately acts as a constraint upon eudaimonia. That what you really want to have are systems that encourage humans to live their best lives, but that takes money, and therefore we focus on the money because it is necessary to have enough money to have eudaimonia. But we have this sort of shell game in capitalism going on, where because we have really good metrics for money, namely the currency itself, we can focus everything on money, but we don't have good metrics for eudaimonia, and therefore we just tend to ignore it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the entire purpose of that system and every system is eudaimonia. And
I think that's overall true of what Beer is doing, but he did say at the beginning of this section that he was going to present things in a form that would be familiar to corporate managers. And I think that actually in this section, that conceit overrides his basic philosophical assumptions. And here he is taking capitalist assumptions as given, right? Yeah. Like, because he's basically saying the opposite, right? That the thing you need to focus on is money, and the well-being of the workers is just a constraint, which is, necessary for accumulation, but nothing more than that.
Yeah.
Tom, go ahead.
I just stepped in. I just was listening to the point about just come in to the point about you were making about the labor power being external, the wage being external. I would have thought that it's both internal and external. It's not like your bosses don't try and fight the class war internally as well as externally. I don't know if I'm misinterpreting what you guys were saying.
I agree with you, Tom, but maybe the way we could interpret this is that your System 3 or even your divisional managers are going to be doing wage suppression and wage theft on their own, and that this is less something that will be involved in the planning process and more something that will be acted on tactically. Now, I think you're in general right, though, that there are cases where a labor unrest can become a matter of strategic planning concern for management, right? Like, if they need to, say, appeal to the government, right, to get the cops to come in and break a strike, or if there's a total industrial action, right?
Wasn't there stuff in the 90s where, like, I remember specifically, I think, hearing, like, Gillette, shave and razors or blades, whatever, that they built overcapacity in many countries so that if one country went on strike, they could meet all their requirements. That would seem to come from that kind of a level. Absolutely.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. It's a really good example of something that would be a corporate planning function and is addressed to labor unrest. So I think that Beer's model is, suffice it to say, philosophically and also technically inadequate regarding labor relations here. Jake H., go ahead.
Yeah, I was like, kind of as I was reading this, I was trying to, map it onto socialist organization or non-capitalist relation-based organization, and just having like, he talks about these like the investment channels and things like you have just been talking about, of like in terms of these sort of capitalist modes of relation as like, but that is sort of the given. And I'm curious, like, if anyone has any thoughts about how to sort of think of it in a way, like, is it if you were to apply it into like into more like an organization generally, not into creating a specific product, like what becomes the product in that case? Is there a product like to replace like the different investment channels and stuff, or is it? I'm just trying to think, like, what is there an analogous thing, or is it like, I don't know. My thoughts are a bit scattered, but
I mean, I guess this is fundamentally about the relation with the external world. So you're going to want to look at what the activity, the sort of transitive activity and the intransitive activity of the organization are, and like plan around that. So I think that you need to do quite a bit of work of abstraction to get from here to a socialist model, especially, for example, if you were, as Jeremy was saying, planning for Udemy, right? That's gonna, does it make sense to talk about Udemy in terms of cost versus revenue? Probably not. You're going to need to operate at a higher level of abstraction to make this work for you. So, it seems very similar to the reproduction schema at the end of Volume 2 to me, because those have often been looked at as inspiration for planning, like in the USSR. The planners would refer to, the theorists and planners would refer to Volume 2 and the reproduction schema there to try to figure out some kind of solution. But it's certainly not the same thing. There's a difference of kind going on here, where this is really oriented towards capitalist production. Like, even if you want to look at something like the money market, it's like, yeah, there would be some kind of analog to that in socialism in terms of, like, basically collective resources available for investment. But it's not a money market. It's a different thing, right? Okay, so we'll go to Shane and then Matt.
Yeah, I think if we're applying this to maybe in the shorter term, applying it to sort of socialist organizing, I think the key thing is to have some kind of metric that represents your relation to the world, right, or a set of metrics. So if we were going with like a kind of, I don't know, like a Mike McNair kind of strategy of going for the continental majority, you'd be wanting to look very carefully at polling of like general support for your movement and such like that, and whatever other metrics you can kind of pull out of the air. The relation between the sort of XY relation between like the leftover earnings versus the money market stuff, well, you'd have to pull that way up to a level of abstraction of like, one of the channels into your reinvestment of energy is going to be stuff that is under your control. Like it's stuff that passes through you already, and then there's stuff that doesn't pass through you already. Similarly, if we look at A, B, and C, we've got existing products, new products, and performance, and that would, I think, translate to existing initiatives, new initiatives, and efficiency in both. So, like, if you're already doing a lot of, tenant organizing, you might find you're maxing that out. And it's like, well, shit, we're going to have to go back to good old-fashioned labor union organizing in parallel, right? Like, so it's that kind of thing of, like, do you keep making MacBooks or do you make an iPod? Well, you kind of have to do both. You have to entertain the possibility of tuning your relative investment in one or the other. And this gets us over this usual fractional kind of left stuff of like, oh no, it's like duck season, rabbit season, right? It's going to be tenant organizing, factory organizing, tenant organizing. Both, you use a fucking strategy to pick both of them or to pick your ratios of both. Use a big fucking strategy model to integrate over time the various fluctuations in these things. So like, I think what he's got on the page here is very much aimed, it's a description of capitalist firms. And there's stuff that would be irrelevant for either for immediate socialist organizing or for the future. But there is, I think that the general pattern, if you squint enough, more or less works. You have to know your metrics. You have to know what your model of your relation to the world is.
And I would kind of point out again that, like, Beer is actually sort of diverging from his framework in presenting this, because in previous sections he has claimed that the VSM is strictly general, and here he's kind of presenting an application of the System 4 principles to firm planning as a sort of proof of concept. But really, this is not the VSM, right? Because it isn't strictly general in that sense. So yeah, this is kind of like a proof of concept here. Matt and then Steve. Go ahead.
Yeah, with respect to like like labor satisfaction stuff, versus like income from the money market. Yeah, I can see how it all plays out in terms of like just like the math of optimization and like constraint satisfaction problems, where it's way easier if you're like just trying to maximize one thing and just for every other variable, like just sort of keep it like within some range, versus like a firm. So if a firm can do that, they can say we just want to get more VC money, like that's what we're trying to keep up and up, and workers just have to be happy enough to not be quitting, and or scared enough. But yeah, for socialist organizing, like it is. Like it's harder to find, I guess, a numeraire or whatever. Because I mean, maybe if we could find like some sort of like either empirically some sort of KPI that maps on that has some predictive value for some kind of success of socialist orgs, or maybe we find something that kind of theoretically makes sense. And I mean, we're trying to increase class consciousness, or some kind of metric of power for the working class. See how much the working class's preferences gets reflected in policy. But I mean, like until then, we don't actually have a way of comparing two unlike things. Like this is how businesses work, and Toyota will have its will have have its regular line. They're, constantly improving, and that funds, risky innovations for like a special projects division. And, like those might come to the bread and butter later down. But yeah, like we don't really have like a way to compare those two things, which is frustrating. Everything is sort of like weird bespoke metrics, if there are metrics at all.
Yeah, and I mean, Beer is pretty clear in the System 2 section that there need to be metrics. But again, he makes that sort of claim that, you can kind of just look at the direction or the tendency of the metrics. I don't know if that really applies to System 4, because that information would be fed into System 4, but System 4 is going to be doing its own research too. So, not super clear on that. Okay, let's go to Rudy, Jake, and then Shane.
I guess it is where the whole problem that I've found in beer comes at. The moment you measure something, the system tends to optimize for what is being measured, like obvious case being number of papers published by a researcher, then you will just get salami publishing. Number of citations, and you just have big citation farms. Do it for a party, number of recruits, you just go and recruit students. So there's always the problem of what you measure might not be what you want to measure. And there's an implicit assumption here that all these things can be measured. And I guess that's where I found the largest problem in beer, is that Jeremy's saying Udemy. Well, Udemy can't be measured. How do you measure if someone is a good person or if someone has had a good life?
I think, again, that kind of gets back to, like, what was it? I forget the exact word, but, like, I think Otto Neurath had, like, a turn of phrase for his, or a label for his thinking. It was some kind of Epicureanism, and he was basically looking at like quality of life indicators as a measure of eudaimonia. That was the approach that he took. I don't know what you could do other than that in terms of quantifying eudaimonia. And, like, there's certainly been, like, recent movements in economics to try to, like, measure happiness or well-being or these kinds of things instead of GDP. That seems to be the kind of direction that Beer is pointing to here, rather than, throwing out quantification. Because if you can't quantify, these feedback systems aren't very useful. Right? You're just making subjective evaluations of things, and it's kind of just going to work itself out through the dynamics of, through social dynamics instead of any kind of organized or design system. Jake, H, and then Tom.
Yeah, I think this definitely, like what you just said, Rudy, about like this is something that I'm having. Problem with whatever, like something that keeps coming up with beer is just like what do these measurements look like, and like for different systems it's kind of become more clear and then less clear as I think about it in different like contexts, in terms of System 2 measurements it seems a bit easier because it's just you can kind of just push it off by saying, well, System 1, you just tell me a measurement, and that's kind of like makes it a little easier because you don't have to like specify it beforehand. Well, with System 4, it keeps like I keep thinking like, well, it's directed, and it's outside facing, which means there's nothing like it has to kind of come up with it whole cloth in a sense. And it, it's like when I think about it on like more like like my specific local organization, it becomes a little more murky because it's like, yeah, what is that? Are we thinking like number of people in the tenants union, or are we thinking like number of workplaces that are being organized, which is good, but it doesn't really tell you about the quality of those or like the direction that those are headed. You can have a lot of people in an organization, but then the organization, like you can have a lot of tenants who have membership of the tenants union, but then if there's not like if they're not actively fighting against the landlord, or they're not actively like resisting evictions or something, then it's not exactly, you're not really getting at what you want to be measuring, which is like the quality of it, which is kind of this, as has been said, kind of a little bit ethereal.
But again, that's something that System 4 wouldn't really look into. right? Because it's too detailed. So I don't think those kinds of things would really be considered by System 4 that much.
Well, I guess I'm thinking of it more in terms of like how you're going to model the future of those parts of the organization. You know, like, are you going to try and say like, well, if we did X, not to reuse variables, but if we did, this thing differently, would the number of tenants that we have in our organization increase? Or if we did this differently, would we be able to more effectively prevent evictions? Which I'm thinking about it more. I can start to see where you could kind of have some numbers that get into it, but again, it's like, does that really hit at the core of it? But then when you kind of abstract it into like the national organization that we're a part of, I've been thinking about this more of just like, because it's kind of being built right now, and so I'm trying to inject more Berian cybernetic architecture to it, or infrastructure to it, and that makes it a little like when you don't have to think about what they're actually doing, like what local affiliates are doing, it becomes a little easier to say, well, like if we just increase the number of people or increase the number of like affiliates to this national organization, then that's like probably what we want, but then it's like, does it get down to the nitty gritty of like what's actually being done? And I guess that is, but also I feel like that is kind of the benefit of Beer, right? Because it's like he's saying, don't concern yourself with this when you're thinking about how to optimize the whole organization. Trust that these things are being done within these the other systems, and then when you're thinking about the total thing, the future of it, it's you're looking at different things. Sorry.
It's also why there is an algorithmic filter that runs all the way up to System 5.
Right.
Because if that problem is happening, it should be alerted to System 5, and it's not exactly the business of System 4 to address it. But that's I mean, these are fair points that you're making. Like, it is not super easy to imagine how this is to be implemented, especially when you consider, like, that concern, like, because these systems kind of have, like, overlapping areas of concern just with, like, different degrees of specificity and action, it can get quite confusing in a way. Tom, go ahead.
Hi, guys. I've just been watching the Vietnam War documentary series by a man, I can't remember his name now, but watching with, what's his name? Something like Jake Bruce. I forget what his name is. But it has a lot of stuff on McNamara, and he was, I think, collecting something like 900 variables for all the stuff that was happening in Vietnam. And I think every month 90,000 pages of reports were being generated. So, like, just to put it in kind of context how crazy it can get. But also, when it came down to it, they were pretty much going on one variable, and that was the kill ratio. How many are we killing versus them? This gets to Rudy's point, whereby that caused them to just, like, do atrocities left, right, and centre. Like, you can just call anybody a Viet Cong. So, like, I think that there is, like, a great art to the choosing of variables. I know it's a real kind of, it's a kind of a scientific problem. Like, when you interact with a system, you change the system. Even at a stupid level, like what do you call it? What's that quantum? What's the one? What's that level? My brain's not working tonight. I'm drinking, but forgive me. But so, like, even when you interact with a system, like trying to measure it, you're going to change it. So, like, I'm watching a documentary the other day about Go, where they designed the system, the computer AI thing or whatever, to beat the Go Grandmaster, the Korean guy. And I think they had, like, some kind of weird, like, kind of a meta variable for trying to understand what whether this good position, this goal was good or not. Like they had some overall kind of this is a good value and a good expected return or something. And it struck me that, like, getting towards Rudy's point that, and also what happened in Vietnam is like that. Say for example, we have. Say we're a socialist party or something, and there's maybe 20 things we want to optimize for in our party, right? So you're in a 20-dimensional space, right? And one of them going up could be good but if another one is going down, that could be bad. So it would seem likely to me that what you might need is kind of meta variables that aren't strictly even understandable on some level. They might be too meta for us to understand, like the fact that this one is going up might mean something really important, and then like you can dig into what constituted that meta variable going up. Because that would take away from this chance of just increasing party members, as opposed to these other 19 things that matter in our dimensional space that our brains aren't optimized for.
Yeah, the series is the Vietnam War by Ken Burns. Ken Burns did that. That's a really good section where he talks about McNamara, because actually this is exactly the problem Beer is pointing to with System 4, right? Where he says that the management is using computers to collect reams and reams of data that they cannot interpret. And that's exactly what McNamara was doing, because he was like, if I just had more data, I could solve this. But it wasn't his job, That wasn't what he was supposed to be doing. And Beer does actually bring that point about affecting the system up. He says, it is the task of System 4 to study all these phenomena through its models, and it ought also to monitor managerial action as being itself a generator of oscillation. So that's a very important point. And indeed, I think the meta variables, we're going to kind of see that when we look at the example of this proto-cybersyn. What are the managers actually dealing with in this situation? It's quite abstracted. Okay, Shane, go ahead.
I think with the meta variables thing, and especially in reference to games like Go and chess, I think that's what they'd call chunking in the study of Go and chess, where grandmasters of chess, they don't actually think about the details of their plays. They sort of chunk patterns of plays into I think what you call meta variables and stack them up, and they're playing literally at a higher level of cognition, where you have these kind of layers of abstraction that cover over the details. So I think that's quite important. That at these levels, you're probably going to be dealing with pretty strange abstractions that are kind of compressing a lot of information. But a lot of this conversation kind of reminds me of I think there's points elsewhere in Beer about this problem of surrogate metrics, or building surrogate models, where we sort of think it's like an XY problem. I care about X, but I can't really affect it directly, and Y seems to be correlated with X, so I'm going to focus on Y instead, or whatever. And I think maybe an analog here with the sort of tenants union stuff or whatever, or political organizing, would be that if we're just counting membership, then that's a kind of surrogate for the thing we actually wanted. So with tenant, at the System 4 level, because System 4 is folding in this information about the external world, and it's folding in an internal external model, these metrics have to be about the world. They can't be about you or your organization. Counting the number of members you have is analogous to counting the number of cells in the body. Who gives a shit? Why would that ever be relevant? Right? They're just cells. The thing you want to control for is something else. So with the tenants organizing thing, if you really think about what you want out of that scenario, you probably want to regulate the rate of eviction down to 0 or something along those lines, right? There's a real scenario out there in the world that you want to control in the way that you're interested in. And you need to measure that. And then you probably need to think about membership and stuff as secondary or tertiary concerns that they're only important insofar as they're related to the regulation of this external thing. Because remember, like, through systems 1 through 3, we were concerned with internal regulation, keeping ourselves stable. But at the level of System 4, we've sort of left some of that behind, and now we're concerned with regulating our relationship with the world and regulating our intentionality. We intend to change things out there. The organism intends to manipulate the world. It intends to organize the world according to the way that it pleases itself. So, like, the spider will regulate the structure of the world so as to bring about a web structure that pleases itself. And we're into external orientation. We need to be thinking of those variables. Because, I mean, if we focus on just membership, so we get the paper member problem. Even this bit about, like, job satisfaction and labor compensation being kind of secondary concerns. We have the same shit in fucking left organizing, like these Leninist cults burning through fucking student cadre or whatever, and just smashing through their fucking cells or whatever. And then you think about what the actual purpose of that is. Well, you've got a couple of downwardly mobile sort of folks who really like to keep their reading groups going or whatever, and that's the real purpose of that organization, right? Or again, the thing I keep bringing up of, like, Trotz having the metric of selling newspapers is just absolutely fucking pointless. It's a surrogate model. It's a thing, it comes up in a lot of the Adam Curtis documentaries as well, right? That we make models of the world, but if we make the wrong models and we measure the wrong things, we get into statistical hallucination, where we start to see meaning in these just deranged models, and these, like, quasi-realities can end up taking over. So yeah, I think I'm definitely with Tom, right? That, like, there's an art to picking the right thing, and there's an art to figuring out what you actually care about, rather than not like tricking yourself into, as an organization, measuring the things that are available. Because I think maybe Matt mentioned the drunkard and the keys problem, where probably for the sake of the listeners, right? The anecdote goes that, like, a policeman is wandering around and he comes across a person searching under a streetlight. He's like, "What's going on?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm looking for my keys." And he's like, "Okay, fine, I'll help you find them." And they're searching around in this pool of light, and I'm like, "There's no fucking keys here." And he's like, "Are you sure you dropped them here?" He's like, "No, of course not, but this is where the light is." He dropped them fucking way back the road, but this is where the light is. This is where the measurable stuff. This is where the stuff that's easy is. And measuring membership is easy. That's the fucking streetlight. But the keys, they're way over there, somewhere off in the dark. We need to be training our attention on that stuff out there, and just discard all fucking notions of this stuff that's easy to measure and immediate to our experience.
Right, and that really does also get back to that kill-death ratio metric, right? It's like, that was not actually useful metric, and it just led to a lot of war crimes.
Kill them all.
Yeah.
We see similar pathology in capitalism, right? That, like, it's a system that has an available metric, which is, earnings and profitability and such. And it's then a feedback circuit that goes insane on just that one metric. And it's the most available thing in the world. It's the most immediately measurable, but it's the most useless thing in the world when it comes to the quality of human life. There's major, major danger in allowing surrogate metrics to run away with themselves. Absolutely. We live in a world that's dominated by this kind of psychotic feedback circuit on something that doesn't matter in the slightest.
Okay, we're going to go to Matt, and then I want to move on.
For a good case study for finding an alternative metric, I think the introduction of sabermetrics into baseball. If we saw that movie Moneyball, I think that's a pretty good case study. There's like a real thing, winning games that that's your objective, and then you figure out the sub-objective, every the exact formulation, but it's like it's some version or another of how often you get on base, and then once you actually find that, you can get a lot better at the thing that you're doing. I've got hope. I think there's stuff we can do.
Yeah, and the example there is essentially complete empiricism of, you have these talent scouts who go out and they're like, I like the arm on that one, or, good running, just kind of these rule of thumb evaluations versus an actual metric-driven approach, which baseball is very amenable to because it can be easily quantified. And of course, the metric-driven approach was more effective in the end and revolutionized baseball. All right, so Anderton, who has experimented with various computer-driven versions of System 4 models, has deducted one lesson about these two regulators, which is highly disturbing. There is a very sensitive, that is, high-gain relationship between product match and revenue performance. Now, the means available to management for handling this sensitive area are the three investment control parameters, A, B, and C. Their relative importance and relative effects are model, hardly understood, particularly in terms of the people who are not line managers who will respond to their manipulation. Most talk about the management of change and innovation is about either economic viability or about human relationships as illuminated by behavioral science. Anderton's case is that we have not really seen the intersection of the two major ecosystemic control loops as occurring exactly in the same domain. Moreover, he says, there is a largely unrecognized coupling between the two loops, which is destabilizing. This is surely a remarkable inference to draw from a simple theoretical model, but it invites profound reflection. To speak personally, it has illuminated much in my experience of actual business problems, which was hitherto obscure. So he's talking about product match, which is to say the match between what the product offers and what the market wants, and revenue performance, which is, I assume your net revenue on the product line. And he's saying we approach like either in terms of market research or in terms of economizing, but we don't actually think of holistically about these two things, and they tend to produce oscillation in the planning mechanism and the organization. Matt, go ahead. Matt, did you just not have your hand down? Okay, we're going to move on unless someone else has something to say about this case. Okay. All right, so as has been remarked before, there is an infinite number of possible models of the corporation, any one of which would count as a tool of System 4. In Figure 38, an attempt is made to map a considerable extension of the model in Figure 36 onto the corporate structure as we have learned to know it in this book. But please beware. The diagram at Figure 38 is not an alternative to, nor even an elucidation of, Figure 27. Now, 27, I believe, was the VSM model.
Yeah. It's like the master diagram.
The master diagram of the VSM. Is explicitly the diagram of a model of System 4. The reason why it looks like the total figure is that System 4 must, in some sense, mirror or map the totality it serves. That is, we are dealing with a recursive logic, one which turns in on and duplicates itself. So we see on Figure 38, essentially, there is a overall section that deals with pretty much like the relationship of overall earnings to investment capital, and also takes into account things like share price, dividends, capital reserves, the money market. It has like a control parameter for measuring like the earnings, money market, investment capital like loop but, these kind of overall access to resources concerns. And then it also has like a model for each division of the kinds of ABXY concerns we talked about ABX, not Y. Y is an overall thing, but ABX for each division in terms of how resources are allocated divisionally. Shane, go ahead.
This last bit feels like the kind of bodily homunculus, or like proprioception or something, that like the System 4 model has to have some sort of abstract model of the body itself, or at least its kind of information flows. That it'll and as Beer notes, this isn't the body.
Yeah.
It's not the same thing. It's the mind's perception of its own body, or it's that was quite fun.
Yeah, exactly. It's a model of the bodily control system which is not identical to the bodily control system because it is directed towards the concerns of System 4 over those of any other system. It's sort of
virtual body.
Yeah, it's a virtual body as seen by System 4. Okay, so let's carry on then. Notes on the development of the Developmental Directorate. Notes on the operation of the Development Directorate. The Development Directorate will consist of people and may indeed involve the activities of a large staff. For, in managerial terms, the Development Director himself must exercise control of all those functions needed to acquire information. Therefore, for instance, marketing research. To evaluate information and propose solutions to policy problems. Therefore, for instance, operational research. And also, actually, to implement whatever adaptive planning processes may be agreed with System 5 that affect the whole corporation. This may lead to his exercising control over the research and development function. It will certainly give him a right of access to all ascending information from the autonomic system, and that may well include responsibility for its very design. So we saw before how System 4 can interact with System 2 to kind of modify the models that are being used. That's what's being mentioned there. Responsibility must lie somewhere, after all, for governing the total information system and for the command structure of the corporation. Nonetheless, our primary concern has to be with the physiological role of System 4 as the biggest switch. We understand its central place between Systems 3 and 5 at the conflux of information between the central command axis and the outside world. We know what it has to do and the kinds of techniques available to these ends, but precisely how is it to operate? For the first time in this book, we shall look beyond anything that has yet been achieved except in embryo. And again, this is written before CyberSyn was made. The real nature of System 4 has never before been exposed, and therefore never organizationally consolidated. Bits and pieces of what we should now call this organizational unit certainly exist in every corporation, but because they are disseminated throughout the corporate structure under different bosses, their interactions with senior management have never been properly codified. The head of operational research, for example, gets along as best he may, selling his activities in an ad hoc fashion. If there is a corporate planning unit, which there ought not to be, it will often be found on the end of some organizational limb, immersed in its models and wholly frustrated by its inability to influence the mainstream of managerial thinking. All of these units, which in terms of our model are all aspects of System 4 activity, lack a means of communication with either the board or the operations directorate, which goes beyond formal committee work, the production of reports, and informal conversation. In the first context, they are suddenly an enemy, seeking to interfere with what management is trying to do. As to their reports, they are not read. The third mode of interaction The informal is by far the most effective, but it is open to all manner of accusations of a political nature. Many large organizations are well nigh in despair about these problems. Successful outcomes seem to depend exclusively on the personalities involved. So what we see is there are three aspects of System 4 that exist in really existing organizations. So the organizational unit has sections in each division. You have also a corporate planning unit, which is divorced from sort of operations, really, like in a meaningful sense, because that's controlled by the divisional heads. And then you have informal communication, which is sort of, obviously your after 5 conversations or hallway conversations or that kind of thing that go on. But none of these things in themselves is System 4. And I think probably the one that is the biggest pitfall is the corporate planning unit, right? We might mistake a corporate planning unit for System 4, but it is not System 4. It's not a whole System 4. It's just part of it. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, just thinking, like, reading this stuff is kind of crazy. It's like every firm I ever worked for, I didn't see any instance of a System 4. Maybe bits and pieces. I worked in the biggest bank in Ireland at the time, Allied Irish Banks, and we were in a part of a research and development, actually a research section, and kind of technology-wise, but also doing other kind of stuff too. That you would think not operational research, but kind of. And in the middle of the boom, what did they do? They sent in the guy who had set this up and who had introduced loads of, over like 30 years, introduced all the systems into the bank, essentially. They all came through the research thing, and a lot of the way they operated had come through this division, and he kind of retired. And then they spent about a year or two, and then they hired a wrecker to come in and wreck the organization. The management didn't want to fire people, so they hired a wrecker to try and make people retire. And it's like, they just basically just shot themselves in their head. They just got rid of probably 25% or 30% of the firm's System 4. I think, corporations don't have this structured. I would be very surprised if 1% of corporations have it structured properly.
Well, that combines very interestingly with your previous comment about labor relations, right? Because they basically lobotomize the corporation so as to kill off the labor force, because they couldn't actually do it any other way. So that's quite a surprising suicidal impulse. It's interesting how these suicidal impulses often come from our thoughts and the mind. And really, System 4 is like the mind, right? And, I guess they just decide to act on that, and then, we'll see what happens afterwards. Woof. But that's an interesting point, that maybe a viable system is not viable in capitalism. There is no such thing in the long term. It has to go through just sort of, in order to be amenable to the constraints of capitalism, it somehow has to destabilize itself. Otherwise, it will just become too internally consistent.
I don't know if I got that far, Kyle.
Well, I don't know. I mean, well, yeah.
like if you think about it, like their environment, it's about surviving within the environment. So like, if the environment is fucked up, that doesn't mean you can't have a viable system in a fucked up environment.
No, I guess what I mean is like planning a viable system in this way may not be possible in the long term because the imperatives of the market are going to impinge so much on the organism that it might not really be possible to maintain consistency there.
Yeah, I think there's questions there.
Yeah, so I don't know. I guess you could say it was a viable move to kill off the internal organization so that it could be, pillaged in some kind of capitalistic way. But that's pretty wild.
It did. I must say, it did go bust within 2 years. But that wasn't the reason.
Okay, Matt, go ahead.
I feel like maybe it's related to like the falling rate of profit. Just because, like, when things get tight, like things that are about like long-term planning and like long-term long-term reward and stuff, and looking out for long-term risks, that does tend to be one of the first things that gets cut. Like just because, like it's not necessarily needed for the day-to-day. Yeah, I mean, maybe you could even look at sort of like hypoxia. Like your body will try to keep the things alive that are required for just like moment to moment life, and so that's why you're more likely to wind up some version of brain dead, but with like your heart pumping and everything, than like for something else to die first, because like with the diminishing resources, like you just can't sustain like having a super blood and like a sugar hungry prefrontal cortex anymore. And in a similar way, like as the rate of profit shrinks, you can't necessarily have like these big these big planning things that are more for like long-term rewards.
Or it might just be like one of those situations where like you're confronted with really difficult life circumstances and you just like go on a bender, It's like I can't deal with this. We gotta shift things around. Shay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think like if bourgeois society is essentially an organism that's at war with itself, it'll always undermine the possibility of these kinds of things being stable, right? That like I think maybe this is calling back to an earlier session, but I think it was Beer's remark that like a viable system does need to be concerned for the welfare of its component organs. And in capitalism we see that maybe happening for a little while, but then it starts to get those impulses again, right? Like it has to attack its own organs to satisfy the market. So it's caught in a double bind between external and internal imperatives. So that you sometimes get it where like even if they wanted to keep everything stable, they can't, right? Like it's you got to start going after your own component parts. And I think maybe the thing I think was Kyle brought up in the much earlier conversation was that like this is kind of the apex with like Nazism, where the state was perfectly willing, in fact enthusiastic, to feed all of its organs into the meat grinder, and that the regime was not satisfied until Berlin was in ruins. That there was an inherently self-destructive drive to it all, and the abject disregard for human welfare, both for the enemy and for themselves, ensured that it couldn't possibly last. We see the same thing in bourgeois society to a lesser extent when it's there, right? Like it'll destroy its organs to satisfy some weird imperative.
Well, it's like you compare the British Empire to the Nazis, like the British Empire, so much better at reproducing itself, both absolutely horrific organizations, but the Nazis, not viable, clearly.
The 1,000-year Reich lasted 11 years.
Yeah, exactly.
That's how viable it was.
Yeah. Okay, well, unfortunately, we're up on time here, so we are going to have to do one more session to discuss this proto-cybersyn next week, which is a fun read, and should be pretty breezy chat. So we will go through that, and then we'll follow up with the next chapter. So thank you for participating, everyone. I am quite interested to see how the section on cybersyn design will affect our understanding of the operations of System 4, and also how the System 5 discussion will color that understanding. So it's going to be good to have like a recap conversation once we're done Systems 1 to 5, because I feel like it's one of those things where, like, Minerva's owl does not take flight until dusk. We don't really get the truth until we have the whole. All right, so let's call it there. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. It's been wonderful.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.